Hello, Scott Hutchison here. I'm going to be doing a demonstration painting only with the knife. Now, why only paint with the knife? There are a number of reasons why you might choose to paint with a knife, and one would be if you want to have more texture on your surface. One might be to add a little more sculptural feel to the work. Perhaps two, you want to use a tool that will kind of get you unstuck, because the brush, a lot of times we get into habits and use the brush in one particular way. And this will force you, as you're painting, to, what I like to tell students, lift your elbow up and down, inside, outside. And so I'll actually find ways to use this in a 360 manner, because it is so limiting. And so if the tool that you use is really limiting, you have to find creative ways of using it. The paint should not only just be on the end as if you're sort of brushing it on, but the whole flat side. And you'll see me doing that during the demonstration. I like the trowel shape because this profile, I can put my fingers in there, and as I'm mixing or applying to the canvas, there's room for my fingers. Also the triangle, I like it really small at the tip. It allows me to get a little more detail. And also, it's very flexible, so as I'm mixing, it's just I prefer that feel rather than the butter shape palette knife or the angle palette knife. So wish me luck. I'm going to give it a go, and I'll see you in a sec. Now, I haven't decided yet if I'm going to begin with a brush to draw it in or a pencil. Now, you can also do this with the palette knife. You can also draw it in with the palette knife. But the image I'm going to work from is fairly complex. I'm going to do a skull here. So in order to better capture the proportions, I may need to draw it out again with the pencil or the brush first, just to make sure that this looks to be in the proportion that I want. So I've decided to paint in the drawing. I'm just going to use a mixture of burnt umber with French ultramarine blue, thin it out quite a bit, and begin the drawing. This is like an 8 by 10. It's pretty small, so it's going to be somewhat of a challenge for a knife painting. But I don't want the image to be right in the middle. I want it to be down to the left because there's a shadow that it casts, which will take a little bit of space up in this negative area here. There'll be a memory of my previous mark, but I'm not too concerned about that. Now the skull, the socket is not a circle. Right, there's a lot of angles, a lot of different kind of twists and turns. Now, even though I'm doing this with a palette knife, I'm still putting in a drawing. And I find that it's really important to have a good drawing first. Now, the knife will only give me so much information, only allow me to show so much detail. How much detail you put in an initial drawing stage is totally up to you. Or if you were doing an underpainting, same thing. The level of detail is really up to you based on your own thoughts and ideas of what you want your piece to be, as well as the approach that you want to take. Now, I find that the stronger the initial structure is, the easier it will be as I move into the painting stage. I used to start off with my paintings very, very detailed, with like a very detailed drawing initially. And nowadays I just block in contour and shapes, and I will find the detail over time. I'm going to map in just a little bit of shadow, just a little bit. This will help me see the drawing as well before I begin. By no means am I after a photorealistic rendition of this skull, or even one that's refined in any way. The refinement is it's going to be interrupted by the knife. How do I simplify the teeth so that it keeps the same spirit of the rest of the piece? I don't want him to look like he's smiling at us, and those teeth to be sort of overdone, at least not at this stage. I think these darks help, don't they? At least for me, it helps me see not only the light source, the direction that the light source is in, but also it shrinks down, the real estate of the light, like how much space that light takes up on the surface. And by darkening it, I can see better those shapes of light and see if the drawing is correct. So because I put those darks in, I can see how this subject sits on the canvas, and I can see if the proportions are what I want. So I'm ready to begin with the knife. It's a very minimal palette. Burnt umber, phthalo green, titanium white, French ultramarine blue, cad yellow light, alizarin crimson, cad red medium, and cerulean blue. This is umber and cerulean blue. This is the shadow of the skull. I see a lot of blues in the skull, blue grays. The knife I'm going to be using is about 1.5 inches or so. And I'm going to begin by mixing up the colors that I see and starting with the shadows. And I'm going to be mapping in the shadows everywhere first. And it's going to start looking a little abstract. And it's going to remain unfinished for quite some time, its appearance at least. And you just have to, if you're working with a palette knife, just have to let that transpire. Let it be ugly. Just keep pushing through until it's finished. So let's first begin with the shadows, shall we? Now I'm using the tip of the palette knife, but I'm applying it with the flat part of the knife and sort of scraping. Trying not to paint only with the tip. Think of it like you're patching a hole in a wall. So you're covering up that hole and you're still trying to make it smooth. And also I'm working in shapes first. So it's very fuzzy, very scratchy initially. When you use a palette knife, it's going to build up quickly. And so I usually build it up through a few passes with the knife. And so you see me scraping the paint off, because I'll get there. As I proceed to soften and kind of just destroy the drawing, I'm going from dark to light. The darks will sit underneath the midtones, and then the lights will sit on top. I'm putting my light in so that I can start to see the relationships. And the sooner I can get rid of the white of the canvas, the better. I would actually say too that in this piece, I'm going to make the lights thicker than the shadows. So it's all going to be pretty thick, pretty built up. Most of the dimension, the sculptural kind of feel will be in these areas. That way they appear more volumetric, like they're coming out at us. If you want something to blend, you can, half of the knife is on the dark and half the knife is on the light, and slightly go over it, and it smashes the two together, and it creates a fade. I want this background to go back in space, and so I'm looking for a greenish blue that is darker here. The skull's going to be light, so let's put it dark back here, and it'll recede, and it'll help that skull come forward. Now I can mix up that transition color, like a color between those two, but instead I'm going to move it around, mix it on the canvas. Now this, I want to transition really quickly. That way it feels like this light right here is more impactful and more like a floodlight. So I'm bringing this dark down, and I'm going to transition really fast. I've got to fill it in here first. There we go. What I'm doing is I'm smashing it with the knife. I find that people either love or hate painting with a palette knife. What person are you? If you've never done it, you give it a try, you'll find out really quickly which kind of person you are. And a lot of it is based on success, right? If it went well or not. But also I find that experience helps. You know, if you're forced to do it a few times and work out the kinks in each one, you'll get closer and closer to what you want. But at the same time, we all are different. And some of us are okay with losing control, and some want to hold on to that, to the object, or control what's in front of us a little bit more. And this wants to, it sort of forces you to be okay with losing control, and also being okay with the piece looking kind of crusty initially. So another way of putting it, sometimes I tell students that the teenage years, that's the awkward stage. This one has a really long awkward stage. You just have to work through it. Keep going, keep going. Paint with a knife, everything is just an approximation. The knife is so general. It's through layers that you can become more and more and more specific. But to start off with, it's going to be fuzzy, like this. Does that help now to see how the skull is popping? And now as I work on the skull, I can actually start forming it, putting volume in the skull. And I can start to pull it forward and out of that background. But without that background in there, at least for me, I have a hard time understanding the relationship of foreground, background. It's okay to push the contrast of light and dark. It's okay to push the values, because the reference it's just that. It's a guide. It's a departure point from reality. So how are you going to make this more interesting and engaging than the photo? As usual, I tend to bounce around. I don't stick in one place for too long. A lot of times what I'm after is balance and the relationships between things, whether it be the value relationships or the color relationships. Sometimes also the relationships of shapes and edges. For example, the reason why I went to the background first, it wasn't a matter of layering that I thought the background needed to be done first. And then the thicker layers of the skull on top. It was about relationships. So once the white was gone from the background, now I can see how light or dark, how warm or cold I can make the skull. And I can at the same time respond to that green. I can respond to it as I work up the skull here. I want this background, this green background, to have an effect on the skull. And I see a little bit of green in parts of the skull, in the lights, putting a reflected light of red in the eyes. Now I want them to still appear dark, so I may need to darken them a little bit more. Even though it's the value of it's dark, this saturation and the warmth of that color pops. It comes out in space, like it pops out in space. So that's the thing about reflected lights, that often it's really easy to add too much white in a reflected light, and then it competes with the actual direct light source. So often my reflected lights are colorful, so they are bright rather than light. I'm beginning to think that if I were to do this over again, and working on a canvas panel with a knife is not ideal, but if you have to do it, quickly stain, get rid of the white. It's the white keeps popping through as I scrape and put more paint down. Inevitably, the metal scrapes into the canvas a little bit, and I can see these little white crackly effects everywhere, and I don't want that to happen. So if I were to do it again, I would gray it out, or in this case, I could probably use either a brown wash or a green wash or something. I don't want to see that canvas. The illusion of the canvas, I want that to be gone, so that I no longer see the canvas, and then you see the illusion of the paint. Whenever I do teeth, palette knife or brush, I always do the negative space first. I don't want the teeth sticking out. Then I have to sort of fool my mind, not look at it as teeth, but just as shapes of light and dark. I'm about 3 hours in, and I'm finding it difficult to layer. But the only way that I can seem to do it, and I'm working on a panel, so it's a rigid surface, and I'm working with a rigid, this knife is rigid. What I'm finding that I have to do in order to keep working it up is I'm barely holding on to the knife, and then I'm slightly tapping, and there's no pressure at all. As I put the paint down, it's released off of my knife a little easier if I just barely tap it. Now I could just let this dry and go over it again, but there is a little bit of a lost opportunity. If I don't work it up now while it's wet, I may miss the opportunity for some of the blending that's impossible to do over the top of dry paint. Also, going over dry paint with new thick layers, it just doesn't, it's like painting over mountaintops. It's very rough. It will be probably even harder to make marks that are consistent. They'll just be bumpy. So that's why I don't want to stop. I want to keep working this up. Now you can go in and, later on, if you let it dry and you want to reestablish, you can take some sandpaper and soften it, or take your knife and scrape over it. This is after it's dry, and you can remove some of the thickest layers of paint. And the reason you'd want to do that is to just smooth it out a little bit so that your new wet layer goes on smoother. I think more could be done with it, but at some point I need to stop and let it sit. So that is a skull painted with the palette knife. So I hope you learned something. I sure did. Every single painting I do, 3 to 3.5 hours was a struggle almost throughout, but it was an enjoyable struggle. So as painting always is. So anyway, thanks for watching. See you later. Bye-bye.